on the NewsChannel 5 network. This is OpenLine.
Hello everyone, welcome to OpenLine. We're talking about a big topic tonight. It's a topic that can be overwhelming, it can sometimes be controversial, but it is critically important. We're talking about climate change. Want to hear your thoughts on this, but I also want to hear from a couple of people who have some very interesting perspectives and important perspectives. Happy to have with us David Galbreath, Professor Dodd Galbreath with Lipscomb University, who has founded the Institute for Sustainable Practice. Professor, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll talk about what that institute is in a moment. Okay. And Gary Garfield, past CEO of Bridgestone Americas from 2010 to 2016.
Correct.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And you're going to give us the business perspective, and we're happy to hear that. But I guess I want to start with what brought each of you to this issue, to climate change. And why don't I start with you? What brought you all both here?
Well, our world is in need of solutions, and we're facing challenges, and we're facing a lot of debates about climate change. And there's a lot of complexity to this issue. And so at Lipscomb, we're trying to train tomorrow's leaders, so we're trying to think through these issues to make sure that they convey these solutions effectively to our political leaders and our society and our business leaders. And I'm also here because I have children, and because I expect my children to have children, and I'm worried about their future.
And as a business person, past CEO of Bridgestone Americas, what's brought you here?
Well, a family relative, a very close family relative, has studied this subject in depth while getting their PhD at the University of California. And he sent me articles, encouraged me to read them, and I started digging into it. And the more I read, obviously the more I learned, and the more concerned I became. And it's so clear to me that we have a very, very important and big problem on our hands. And for exactly what Dodd just mentioned, I'm here because of my kids and my grandkids. This climate change will have a limited impact on me because of my age. It's going to have a huge impact on them if we don't do something about it. And that's really why I'm here.
From the business perspective, so you were CEO, again, from 2010 to 2016. At that time, what was your thought about climate change? Was it on your radar? Was it a way that you were working with your business? How did it impact what you did, and how on your radar was it?
It was very much on my radar. I talked about it regularly within the company. It helped form some of our policy decisions and strategic decisions. And Bridgestone, as a corporation, takes the environment and climate change extremely seriously. So it fit perfectly with what the science said. We had to do what we reasonably could do about it and still be competitive in our business.
Because some of the concern is, I would think, we've got to make the most profit we possibly can. And to do some things that would increase sustainability might cut back on our profit. And I guess, are you able to confidently say that we can do both, or is it that we need to think less about profit and more about our future?
Yeah, it's a really good question, very complicated question. In my opinion, there's no question we can do both. If we deal with climate change, it is not the end of the world or the end of our economy. In fact, it's the opposite. If we don't deal with it, then we have a very big problem on our hands for human beings. We may not survive. But I believe very strongly that you can let the free market work and work well, and take action on climate change, and companies can do very well. And it can be very good for people. Just by way of example, solar energy and wind-powered energy, renewable energy. If you get that up and running, it's free. There's not an ongoing costs. You don't have to purchase oil, you don't have to purchase gas, you don't have to purchase coal. It's free. And that would be true for manufacturing, and that absolutely would be true for individuals. There's the capital cost of, okay, you have to maintain the wind turbine or whatever it is, replace the solar panels, but that's a fraction of what we pay today for electricity.
And I want to delve into that more, but I want to, Professor Galbreath, the Institute for Sustainable Practice, what is that? How did that come about? And tell us what that is.
Well, President Randy Lowry, when he came to Lipscomb, he wanted to create new innovative programs that would meet emerging needs and would be future focused. And climate change was an emerging issue at the time. We were just beginning to see huge investments in these renewable energy industries by the federal government, by investors. The stock market was down about the time that our institute was formed, and so we were hearing from investors from overseas who were looking for places to put their money. And so those were signals to us that this was more than just a fad. This was not just a environmentally ideological driven initiative. This was an initiative to find new ways to make money, new ways to use money and capital resources more efficiently. And so we formed the Institute around the concept of that people need degrees in sustainability and renewable energy and green building systems and sustainable food systems, so that we could come up with modern solutions to meet these challenges, and so that we could have professionals out there who could lead the way.
And if we have an audience here, if there are people out there who say, I don't believe in climate change, it's political, and I just don't believe in it, what do each of you say? And I'll start with you, Professor. Address that.
I think that's fair and important that people state their concerns and state their beliefs. Gary and I met through dialogues that were arranged by various organizations to try to get to the bottom of why people have a lot of skepticism about climate change. And that's really the first step in making progress, is having a conversation about it, allowing people to vent their frustration and to share their fears and to ask detailed questions about the solutions. And of course, the second step beyond that is trying to find common ground. Do we agree that free fuel is a good idea? And that's generally a good starting point. That's often the reason why investors and economists find a lot of value in this sustainable technology movement that we're seeing. But more importantly, we all share what John F. Kennedy talked about, and that's our children's future.
And how, well, and so to skeptics, what would you say?
I'd say four things. I'd say, first of all, we know it. We know this is going on. We see it all the time. I've lived in Nashville since 1991. We used to get snow in the winter in Nashville. We don't get snow anymore. We see that. There was the flood several years ago. There have been floods in Houston. There are floods now in Kansas and Nebraska. The incredible heat wave that just went through the Northeast, New York City and Boston were near 110 degrees. Paris was 110 degrees. These are places where homes don't have air conditioning because they never needed it. We see it going on. So that's the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say, the overwhelming scientific consensus, some 97-98% of all climate scientists say this is real and it's caused by man putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The third thing I would say is, if you don't believe me, and that's fine, don't believe the scientists, that's fine, just believe what the Trump administration says. A year ago, the Trump administration produced a document. It's called a Draft Environmental Impact Statement, prepared by Rick Perry's Department of Energy, Scott Pruitt's EPA, and Elena Chow's Department of Transportation. And that document was required under law for proposals that the administration put out to reduce car fuel efficiency standards. And in there, that 500-page document, about 100 pages are devoted to climate change. And what it says, and I've read it several times, what it says is climate change is real. Climate change is caused by man putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the predominant greenhouse gas of which is carbon dioxide. Because of those greenhouse gases that we've been putting into the atmosphere, the temperature of the Earth has raised about 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit since the Industrial Revolution began. Most of that has occurred since the mid-1970s. It goes on to describe in those 80 to 100 pages on climate change the devastation that will occur in our country on our current path. That's what the Trump administration says. The fourth thing I would say, and anyone can look that document up online, the fourth thing I would say is, given what the overwhelming scientific community is, given what the Trump administration said in that document, the risk of ignoring it is untenable. If they are right, if the scientists are right, if the Trump administration is right, we are going to have a largely unlivable planet. And we can't take that risk because we have nowhere else to go. So we have to act on it.
We have to act, and yet, as I said at the top of the show, it can almost seem overwhelming. What I've heard is, okay, sure, maybe the climate's changing. How do we know it's because of what human beings are doing? That's one. You somewhat addressed that. And then two, if it is what we are doing, it's almost so overwhelming. Can we turn this tide around? You're talking about the stuff we're putting out into the air. Well, let's say the United States unilaterally does something, and then China is a big, coal producer. And can what you said is dire. Are you optimistic we can turn this ship around?
Yeah, definitely. The advances that we made in renewable energy over the last few years have shown us that wind has been competitive with coal for about a decade now. There are some markets in the country where solar utility scale energy is competitive with natural gas. So economically, we know we can make it work. The biggest challenge is going to be in the paradigm shift. Carbon is, according to NASA, a very significant factor in a planet that is too warm. We all know and trust the images and the data that NASA has sent back from their journeys to Jupiter, to Saturn, where they've visited the moon Titan. We have the Tennessee Titans here in town, so that's probably a memorable moon. Mm-hmm. And NASA took samples from that atmosphere and found out that there is liquid methane on that moon. They have taken similar atmospheric samples from other planets in our solar system and have found that where carbon has exceeded the percent that we have on our planet, those worlds are too warm to allow water to exist. And so we have clear planetary data that shows how far this could advance if it's allowed to advance. But the solution is just grappling with the reality that this is something we've got to deal with, just like many of the historical challenges our society's faced over the history of our country, which we've dealt with very successfully. And
do you feel like it's a challenge we can meet? Because I think, again, some people are overwhelmed and they're like, regulation's tough, and when we put new regulation on, it's scary, it maybe could suppress profits. I guess if people are concerned that there's not much we can do, you're saying there is a lot we can do to prevent the kind of catastrophe you're talking about. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I ran a very large company, and I believe in the free market. Now, the free market isn't perfect. We know that. And there are so many examples of it not being perfect. Just by way of example, if a company improperly obtains a monopoly position, which it can do from time to time, that's not the free market working, and the government has to step in. And the government requires that companies have honest and full and fair financial disclosures so that the free market will work. So I believe very strongly in the free market. The problem with climate change is we release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere when we use fossil fuels, and no one pays for it. The free market doesn't pick up that cost, but we as a society will have an enormous cost to deal with it. And yet the free market doesn't pick up that cost. Just like someone collects my garbage. I have to pay someone to collect my garbage. And sometimes the city provides that service. Well, you pay for it in the form of taxes, but no one's doing it with greenhouse gases. So this is what has to happen. We have to have a carbon offset so that that cost is accounted for. And it's not my idea. Secretary James Baker, an extraordinary individual and Secretary of State under President Bush, and Secretary George Shultz, who was Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, and Secretary Henry Paulson, who was Secretary of the Treasury under George Bush, and Ben Bernanke. These are all Republicans. They have proposed this carbon offset. And that will do an enormous amount for us to make other forms of energy more competitive.
Well, they're telling me I need to go to break, but I want to ask you, so as a businessman, if that is proposed, a carbon offset,
yes,
will there be companies and special interests that would fight that?
Absolutely.
And so then, let's say we do it next year.
Okay.
And then China doesn't do it. Where does that leave us?
Yeah, well, first of all, China has already started a form of carbon offset. They're ahead of us on this. They have a cap and trade program that they instituted in 2017, if I remember correctly. We're actually behind China in this regard. And kind of as an aside, and I'll come back to your question, China's, for every dollar we spend investing on research and renewable energy, China spends $3. We are falling way behind. But going to your question, China already has a cap and trade program, but what Secretary Baker, Secretary Shultz, Secretary Paulson, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, and others have proposed is just impose a tariff on those goods coming into our country, so that will level the playing field, and you can give companies credit as they're exporting goods to other countries so that we can still be competitive. And the projections are this will go a huge way, not all of the way, but a huge way towards dealing with the climate crisis.
Just to give you another example, Saudi Arabia in 2018 issued the world's largest RFP for a solar initiative in their country. So if the people who possess most of the oil in the world are concerned about being competitive in energy in the future and are investing in renewable energy, that should tell us something.
And before we go to break, okay, so if it would be fought by special interests, do you think this country has the political will to get something like that passed?
Yeah. That's the big question. And here's where this show and talking about the issue come into play, in my opinion. In my opinion, politicians, our leaders, our congressmen, our senators, our governor, and others will respond to the will of the people. And if the will of the people is we care about the life that our kids and grandkids are going to have, and I do believe we care. We are good people, by and large. We care, and we want you to deal with this, and deal with it in a meaningful and responsible way. And if you won't, we'll find someone who will. If that's the will of the people, then I believe very strongly our leaders will act.
All right, well, that sets the table for the discussion. If you're on the line, hold on. I'm going to get to your call. Joe, Cheryl, Granger, others. If you want to call in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. Take a break. We'll be back right after this.